Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a term that's, well, it's rapidly gaining traction to describe our current global condition, the polycrisis. It's a concept that feels increasingly relevant, captures a sense of interconnected challenges many of us are probably already feeling.
Indeed. We're truly moving beyond thinking of these huge challenges like climate change or economic instability, social fragmentation as, isolated issues. What the sources you send over consistently show is that the polycrisis signifies a state where multiple distinct crises don't just happen at the same time. They actually interact in ways that their combined effects are far greater and, frankly, far more unpredictable than just the sum of their individual parts.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack this powerful concept. We want to understand not just what the polycrisis is, but how these seemingly separate crises are so deeply tangled up. Explore the underlying forces driving them, and really confront what might happen if we don't address them systemically. And most importantly, we'll delve into the pathways for genuine transformation. What kind of leadership, what kind of collaboration is needed to navigate this incredibly complex reality? You've sent us a truly fascinating stack of material, and we're ready to dive in.
Okay, so when I first hear polycrisis, my mind immediately goes to, a bunch of problems happening at once. But the sources make it really clear it's far more than that. They call it a fundamentally new reality. What's the key difference there? What makes it so much more challenging than just, say, a series of unfortunate events?
That's an excellent distinction to make, yeah. While we've always faced multiple challenges, the profound insight here is that the polycrisis isn't just an escalation of every problem we have. It's a state where various shocks, maybe initially disparate, interact and actually amplify each other. This makes the whole situation far more overwhelming than its individual components would suggest. Adam Tooze, the British historian, really championed this term. He emphasized that a problem becomes a crisis when it challenges our fundamental ability to cope, when it even threatens our identity. So it's not just navigating a rough patch, it's more like an existential challenge to our established ways of living, even thinking.
So it sounds less like a perfect storm, which feels a bit random, and more like a massive interconnected system where one point of failure can just unravel many others.
Exactly, that's the core of it. It emphasizes the complex connections, the feedback loops. Think about our global food systems, for instance. They aren't just threatened by, say, a single issue like drought, that'd be bad enough, but they're simultaneously vulnerable to environmental challenges like climate change hitting crop yields,
Right.
geopolitical conflicts disrupting vital supply chains, and even pandemics affecting labor and distribution. The critical insight here, and the sources really hammer this home, is that understanding these deep systemic links can help prevent these single crisis interventions, the kind that might inadvertently create new problems somewhere else because you weren't looking at the whole picture.
Yeah, compartmentalizing.
Exactly. Our default is often to compartmentalize, so maybe you focus solely on increasing agricultural yield, right? But if you don't account for climate change's impact on water scarcity or how political stability affects trade routes, well, that solution is just inadequate. It can even backfire in a polycrisis world.
What's particularly fascinating, I thought, was the distinction the sources make between a polycrisis-like, a generic concept for any time multiple crises happen together, and the polycrisis referring to our unique, specific historical era. Can you elaborate a bit on why our current situation is seen as so distinct?
Yeah, this distinction is absolutely crucial because the polycrisis denotes this specific epoch where humanity has quite uniquely created an unprecedentedly interconnected and interdependent world. We're kind of at this paradoxical point. We possess vast material wealth, incredible technological prowess, yet simultaneously face radical inequality and are teetering on the brink of ecological collapse. This isn't just history happening as usual. The data is stark. CO2 levels, historical highs. The sheer mass of human-made stuff now exceeds all living biomass on the planet. And a new mass extinction event is, well, unequivocally underway. We are, in effect, living on a fundamentally different planet than previous generations did. Some parts might soon become uninhabitable, disrupting settlements, ecosystems, things we've taken for granted. So our ability to learn from history, in some ways, it's almost negligible. Why? Because such a unique combination of social, political, economic, and ecological factors has just never happened before. This specific moment truly sets us apart. It demands new ways of thinking, adapting, responding, ways that go beyond historical precedent.
It sounds like this hyperconnectivity you mentioned is a major part of what makes this polycrisis so unique, so potent. So why are these crises so deeply intertwined right now? It seems like neoliberal globalization played an enormous, maybe unintended role in setting this stage.
It absolutely did. This hyperconnectivity, this interdependence we see everywhere today, it's a direct result of decades of neoliberal globalization.
Yeah.
This dominant economic project, which really gained steam in the late 20th century, fundamentally prioritized maximizing efficiency and open market access.
Right.
But often, and this is critical, it came at the explicit cost of systematically stripping away crucial social and environmental safeguards.
Right.
It's a really critical point because the very architecture of our global systems designed for maximum efficiency, maximum profit, inadvertently remove the redundancies, the buffers that normally provide resilience in a volatile world.
So we traded robustness for speed and lower costs, essentially.
Pretty much.
So it connected everything, but also, almost paradoxically, made everything really similar.
Yeah.
That feels counterintuitive. Usually you think more connections make something stronger, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does homogeneity specifically reduce resilience?
That's it. You've nailed a crucial point. It massively increased the connectivity of global systems. Think just-in-time supply chains spanning continents, global finance moving instantly, air travel linking everywhere. But critically, it also increased their homogeneity. Common standards, common technologies, business models, even cultural norms were adopted worldwide, often pushed by the biggest economic players. This drive for uniformity, while it seems efficient in the short term, actually reduced systemic diversity. And in nature, diversity is strength, right? It gives you backup options, different ways to respond to shocks.
Okay, that's you.
When everything operates on the exact same logic, a single point of failure or a shared vulnerability can spread globally with unprecedented speed and scale.
And where it gets really interesting, as the sources highlight, is that complexity science actually shows this very combination. High connectivity and high homogeneity make systems exceptionally prone to rapid discontinuous change.
Cascading
failures.
Yes, exactly. And this is why a shock in one seemingly isolated part of the system, whether it's a novel virus popping up in Wuhan, a container ship getting wedged in the Suez Canal, or a subprime mortgage default in the U.S., can now propagate globally with such devastating speed and scale. The sources are absolutely clear on this. Systemic risks like financial turmoil, global pandemics, the rapid spread of ideological extremism. They are, in this sense, endemic to globalization.
Features, not bugs.
Features, not bugs. They aren't just problems in the system to be fixed. They are, in fact, features of the current world order, which means we can't simply isolate and fix them as one-off problems. They're built into the very fabric of our interconnected world.
Okay, this understanding of embedded risks leads us right to what the sources identify as the four core foundational drivers of the polycrisis: growth-dependent capitalism, pervasive patriarchy, the accelerating climate crisis, and increasingly fragile global health systems. These aren't just separate problems sitting side by side, are they? They're described as a deeply interlocking system.
That's absolutely right. They haven't just emerged independently, they've co-evolved into what one source powerfully calls a capitalist patriarchy extractivism complex. And this complex isn't just generating the polycrisis as some unfortunate side effect. The sources present the polycrisis as its logical, almost inevitable outcome. This systemic understanding is paramount because it immediately reveals why piecemeal solutions trying to fix just one driver in isolation are fundamentally insufficient.
Right, it's like trying to untangle a really complex knot by just pulling on one string.
Exactly. You often just tighten the knot elsewhere or create new snags. The sources emphasize that to truly address the polycrisis, we need to transform the entire operating logic of the system, not just patch up its symptoms.
Let's start with capitalism, then. The sources even use this term capitalizogenic disease. That's a pretty strong claim. Can you unpack what that really means in practical terms, beyond just, say, harmful products? What's the systemic mechanism?
It's a fascinating term, isn't it, and provocative. Capitalizogenic disease basically posits that many widespread health crises aren't just random occurrences or purely biological. They're actively produced or at least significantly exacerbated by the capitalist system itself. And yeah, it's not just about corporations promoting harmful products like tobacco, sugary drinks, ultra-processed foods, though that's part of it, driving profitable but unhealthy consumption. It goes deeper. It encompasses, for instance, the millions of preventable deaths caused by patent regimes that prioritize pharmaceutical profits over universal access to essential medicines. We saw this tragically during the AIDS crisis, right? Life-saving drugs were unaffordable for millions in the global south for years.
I remember.
Similarly, the persistence of neglected tropical diseases, which overwhelmingly affect the poor. Well, developing treatments often isn't considered profitable enough by the dominant market logic. So the systemic mechanism is that inherent drive for profit over public good. It leads to policies and practices that undermine health for huge populations, essentially making healthcare a commodity, not a universal right. It really challenges how we think about health crises.
And patriarchy is described as a threat multiplier. That sounds like it makes all the other crises worse somehow.
Absolutely. Patriarchal systems aren't really a separate crisis silo. They're a foundational logic, deeply interwoven with capitalism and environmental degradation. UN Women, other bodies, they consistently show the polycrisis impacts are not gender neutral. Far from it. They amplify existing gender inequalities. They pose unique, disproportionate threats to women and girls. Think about it. When climate disasters strike or conflicts erupt, women often bear the disproportionate burden. Displacement, food insecurity, increased gender-based violence.
Why is that?
Because pre-existing patriarchal structures limit their access to resources, to decision-making power, to safety nets. So addressing patriarchy isn't just a matter of social justice, though it certainly is that. It's a critical, non-negotiable part of building overall system resilience. You simply can't solve the climate crisis or achieve economic stability if half the population is systemically disadvantaged and made more vulnerable.
Makes sense. And the climate crisis, of course, looms large. It's not just a crisis. The sources highlight it as a foundational stressor, a universal threat multiplier.
Yeah.
How does it interact with the others to create this compounding effect?
That's precisely it. The World Health Organization, the WHO, has unequivocally declared climate change a fundamental threat to human health. It has the potential to unravel decades of progress in global health, and its impacts are far from isolated. They propagate through these interconnected systems, creating cascading risks, often unpredictable, incredibly hard to manage. Think about the chain reaction. Rising temperatures, erratic weather. They directly affect agricultural yields, right, leading to food insecurity. That insecurity can then trigger mass migration, people fleeing uninhabitable areas or resource scarcity, which then puts immense strain on receiving communities, often escalating into social friction, even conflict. So climate change isn't just an environmental problem. It's a profound socioeconomic, geopolitical, and public health crisis. It's the initial, powerful force destabilizing nearly every other system.
And finally, our global health systems themselves are becoming more fragile. That seems particularly terrifying given all these other accelerating threats.
Yes, the sources reveal a really concerning trend here. Decades of neoliberal policies have systematically eroded the resilience of global and national health systems, especially in the global south. Things like deregulation, widespread privatization, marketization. It led to chronic underfunding of public health infrastructure. It created inequitable two-tiered systems where your access depends on your wealth. And it fostered a focus on profitable treatments over essential preventative care. The consequence, as we saw so starkly during COVID-19, is that populations are left acutely vulnerable when major shocks hit. Health systems lack the surge capacity, the equitable access, the resources needed to respond effectively.
So it's a dangerous convergence.
Exactly. A world simultaneously more prone to health emergencies and demonstrably less equipped to handle them. It's a vicious cycle where health crises deepen other systemic fragilities, making the polycrisis even more potent.
So we've painted a pretty clear, maybe pretty stark picture of how entangled these crises are. The big question then becomes, what happens if we don't address this polycrisis systemically, at its roots? It sounds like we're already seeing some pretty grim consequences unfolding globally.
You're absolutely right. The sources are stark in their assessment here. Inaction isn't some neutral choice. It's a very active decision to accept a future of escalating instability, deepening inequality, and widespread human suffering. The abstract risks of systemic failure, the things we might discuss in academic terms that are already manifesting as concrete, tangible human suffering on an unprecedented scale right now across the globe.
We're not talking distant future stuff.
Not at all. Present realities.
Okay, let's look at some of those concrete realities. First, tell us about the projected scale of mass migration driven by these converging crises. The numbers sounded staggering.
Mass migration is indeed one of the most visible, most immediate consequences. Climate change alone is projected to be the primary driver of human displacement this century. The projections for climate refugees or internal migrants by 2050, they are truly staggering. You see ranges from a conservative estimate of 143 million by the World Bank up to over 1.2 billion by the Institute for Economics and Peace.
Wow, 1.2 billion.
It's hard to even comprehend, and this isn't a problem for tomorrow. Between 2008 and 2016, an average of 21.5 million people annually were already displaced by weather-related events.
Already.
So this mass movement, driven by rising sea levels making coasts uninhabitable, desertification turning farmland barren, extreme weather destroying homes and infrastructure, it will place immense, unsustainable pressure on resources and social systems in receiving regions. And that dramatically increases social friction and tragically violent conflict, especially in states with low resilience or existing political fragility. The human toll is immense, but so is the potential for destabilization.
And food insecurity. It really seems like Ukraine's critical role as a global grain producer and the disruptions there highlighted just how fragile our global food systems have become in the face of conflict and climate change.
It absolutely did. A stark reminder. The polycrisis severely disrupts global food systems through these compounding impacts. You have climate change directly disrupting harvests and agricultural cycles. You have geopolitical conflicts disrupting vital supply chains. Ukraine being the prime example, the breadbasket of Europe suddenly disrupted.
I know.
And then add economic shocks, driving up food prices, making basic sustenance unaffordable for millions. The Global Report on Food Crises 2025, it painted a grim picture. Over 295 million people faced acute hunger in the previous year, with conflict-driven famine reaching catastrophic levels in places like Sudan and Gaza.
Terrible.
And climate change is projected to further reduce yields across diverse regions, increase price volatility, threatening to push hundreds of millions more into malnutrition, even starvation. It's a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions, driven by these interlocking factors.
This convergence of resource scarcity, migration, economic instability.
Yeah.
It also sounds like a tinderbox for widespread conflict, doesn't it?
Indeed. It absolutely is. The convergence of dwindling resources, profound economic instability, unprecedented mass migration, and failing governance. It creates ripe conditions for both internal social unrest and full-blown interstate conflict. The World Economic Forum's 2025 Risk Report underscores this immediate danger of state-based armed conflict, and it's exacerbated by escalating geoeconomic confrontation, deepening societal polarization within nations.
So it's fighting over resources.
Competition over dwindling critical resources like water and arable land is expected to become a more frequent trigger for violence, yes, particularly in already fragile regions, sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, parts of South Asia. These factors create a dangerous feedback loop. Conflict further destabilizes systems, leading to more suffering, leading to more conflict. It's a grim spiral.
So it's not just about the immediate humanitarian suffering, immense as that is, but also about these long-term systemic risks, some of which the source material even describes as existential. That's a truly terrifying word to use.
It is, and the analysis unfortunately supports its use. A comprehensive analysis of future risks identified 29 out of 40 individual risks as globally catastrophic, meaning they'd affect the entire human population for at least several generations, causing significant widespread harm.
29 out of 40.
29 out of 40. But even more concerning, 3 risks were identified as existential, meaning pan-generational scope, crushing severity, the potential to ruin life for all future generations.
Okay, what are they?
These are the loss of power by humans, environmental disasters, and environmental degradation. And strikingly, the latter two fall squarely under the failure of the green transition risk cluster.
So our inability to handle climate and ecology is the direct path to existential threat.
That's what the analysis suggests. It truly underscores the profound long-term implications of our current trajectory and the absolute urgency of finding a different path.
That loss of power by humans one is particularly intriguing. What does that actually mean in this context? Is it like AI takeover?
It refers to several potential pathways, yeah. AI is one aspect. Another involves the rise of concepts like eco-democracy, which advocates for legal rights for non-humans, animals, rivers, ecosystems, based on our fundamental interdependence. If nature gains legal personhood, human activities exploiting it would be legally constrained. That fundamentally reshapes our relationship with the environment, potentially limiting some current lifestyles.
Interesting.
Then there's the increasing reliance on advanced technology, particularly AI, which could potentially surpass human capabilities in various domains. The concern isn't necessarily a sci-fi takeover, but that as AI integrates more deeply into decision-making systems, humanity could gradually cede its dominance, or even risk poor decisions if technical failures or biases are overlooked. The core question becomes, will these incredibly powerful tools ultimately serve humanity and the planet, or could they override human agency and control?
And other risks, like you mentioned, a persistent interrupted food supply. that could trigger not just famine, but government collapse, civil wars if it goes on long enough. That cascading effect again.
Precisely. That's the insidious cascading effect of the polycrisis. A critical supply chain breaks down. The impacts aren't limited to inconvenience. They can quickly spiral into profound humanitarian crises, famine, political instability, collapse. And we also see how the systematic erosion of democracy through foreign interference, loss of trust in institutions, the rise of authoritarianism is also highlighted as a critical risk. Political leaders often concentrate on immediate short-term gains rather than tackling these long-term complex systemic risks. That contributes to this erosion.
Short-sightedness.
Exactly. And that short-sightedness in governance just exacerbates the long-term problems, making societies more brittle, more prone to collapse under the pressure of the polycrisis.
So hearing all this, it sounds less like we should be focused on preventing some grand, singular unraveling event, and more about navigating an ongoing, compounding series of transformations that are already underway.
That's a very astute observation. The sources unequivocally argue that systemic crisis is already here, and in many ways it's inevitable. Our current way of life, linear, extractive, growth-dependent, it simply cannot be maintained within planetary boundaries. It's just not physically possible. So we must adapt to situations where normal no longer has meaning, where the past isn't a reliable guide for the future. The fundamental challenge, therefore, isn't really to avoid the great unraveling, because aspects of it are happening and will continue. It's to influence its extent and, crucially, what we make of it, what comes next. This requires a profound shift in mindset, from problem-solving in a static world to continuous adaptation, learning, transformation in a dynamic, unpredictable one.
So this isn't a Hollywood-style apocalypse scenario then, but maybe something more nuanced, more complex, a compounding series of crises requiring a different kind of mindset to navigate.
Exactly. It requires what the sources call holding a liminal space, that uncomfortable in-between period where the old ways are failing but the new ones haven't fully emerged yet. This isn't about finding quick fixes. It's about developing a capacity for prolonged uncertainty. It means thinking the unthinkable without succumbing to despair. Accepting that some things we cherished might change irrevocably, resisting both blind optimism, everything will be fine, and crushing hopelessness, we're doomed.
That's a hard balance.
It is. It's about stretching ourselves personally and professionally, and importantly, practicing self-care and collective care, because this journey demands sustained effort and resilience from all of us. The consequences are unfolding now. They will worsen on our current path. That highlights the urgency, but also the need for sustained, compassionate, wise engagement. We're in a phase of constant flux where our ability to adapt, learn, collaborate, that will truly define our future.
Okay, this sounds like a monumental task, navigating such profound uncertainty. But the sources also offer a theory of change for systemic transformation, implying there is a path forward. Where do we even begin when the problems are so deeply entrenched, so interwoven?
Well, given the diagnosis of the polycrisis as this self-reinforcing system of entangled crises, driven by growth-oriented capitalism and patriarchal exploitation, it demands an equally systemic response, tinkering at the margins of the existing paradigm. It's just not viable anymore. It's like trying to fix a fundamentally leaky boat with a teacup while the hull is structurally compromised.
Right, doesn't work.
Doesn't work. The ambitious but necessary goal is to redesign the underlying operating system of our global society, to make it regenerative, distributive, and resilient by design. And the crisis itself, paradoxically, presents what the sources call a poly-opportunity.
A poly-opportunity.
Yeah, it's basically a non-negotiable invitation to consciously, collaboratively design the successor to the very systems that brought us to this precipice. It's a chance, maybe our only chance, to build something fundamentally different and hopefully better.
And this foundational redesign, as you said, it has to start with a crisis of imagination, doesn't it? Moving beyond that deeply ingrained idea of endless GDP growth as the ultimate goal.
Correct. For far too long, our definition of prosperity, of progress, has been uncritically tied to GDP growth. And it's a metric that, while maybe useful in some contexts, fundamentally fails to account for ecological degradation, depleting natural capital, rampant social inequality.
Not to mention just basic human well-being.
Exactly. It ignores well-being and flourishing. But the good news is that several alternative frameworks are emerging, offering compelling visions for economies that actively prioritize human and ecological well-being rather than just endless economic expansion.
Okay, let's hear about them. Tell us about degrowth first. It sounds provocative, maybe even a little scary to some people. What does it actually mean in practice?
Degrowth is definitely provocative, yeah, because it directly confronts capitalism's sacred cow. the growth imperative. But it's crucial to understand it's not a recession. A recession is unplanned, chaotic economic contraction, often leading to widespread suffering.
Right, that's imposed on us.
Exactly. Degrowth, instead, advocates for a planned, democratic, and equitable downscaling of production and consumption, primarily in wealthy nations where resource use is highest and often unsustainable. The core aim is simple, really. Bring human economic activity back within safe planetary boundaries, recognizing that limitless growth on a finite planet is, well, impossible.
Seems logical.
It emphasizes sufficiency over excess, genuine well-being over just accumulating more stuff, radical wealth redistribution, a shorter work week, freeing up time for community, for care, expanding public services in the commons rather than privatizing everything. Now, critiques often focus on its political feasibility. Can we actually do this? And the risk of economic instability if it's not managed incredibly carefully. But its core principle is a fundamental challenge to the status quo, forcing us to redefine progress.
Okay. And then there's Donut Economics by Kate Raworth.
Yeah.
That seems to offer a more visual, more immediately graspable framework for this reimagination.
It does provide a powerful and visually intuitive model for redefining economic goals. Imagine a donut, right? The inner ring represents a social foundation. That identifies the 12 essential dimensions of human well-being, things like food, water, health, education, social equity, drawn from the Sustainable Development Goals. Nobody should fall below this foundation into the hole.
Got it. The minimum standard.
Exactly. The outer ring represents an ecological ceiling. This consists of the 9 planetary boundaries: climate change, biodiversity loss, freshwater use, etc. Humanity must not overshoot this ceiling. So the goal is to bring all of humanity into that safe and just space inside the donut through economies that are regenerative and distributive by design. Crucially, it's agnostic about growth. It explicitly shifts focus away from GDP as the primary goal.
Okay.
Now, it's an aspirational framework. It provides the what the goal, but often requires other models for the practical implementation, the how.
And speaking of how, the circular economy seems like a very practical application of some of these ideas, tackling waste head on.
It absolutely is. It's a key design philosophy directly challenging that dominant take, make, dispose linear model, which, by the way, currently generates over 2 billion tons of waste annually. And that figure is projected to rise significantly without major intervention.
Staggering.
It is. The circular model has 3 core principles. First, designing out waste and pollution right from the outset. Second, keeping materials and products in use for as long as possible through repair, reuse, remanufacturing, recycling. And third, regenerating natural systems, actively restoring ecological health, not just minimizing harm. And we see tangible examples in practice globally. Seoul's Sharing City initiative redefines ownership. Phoenix has a resource innovation campus rethinking waste as a resource. Even Ukrainian companies like Oki's turning used coffee grounds into biodegradable eyeglass frames.
Cool.
In construction, there's growing exploration of mass timber, designing buildings for easy disassembly so components can be reused. It shows how practical innovation can align with these broader systemic goals of sustainability and resilience.
And then there are broader post-capitalist models, which really take on the whole system more directly, envisioning something beyond capitalism as we know it.
Yeah, these frameworks envision fundamentally different economic systems, ones that transcend the private ownership and profit-driven markets defining traditional capitalism. They tend to emphasize economic democracy, decentralization, and the concept of the commons resources managed collectively for the benefit of all, rather than being privately owned and exploited.
Okay, like what?
Examples include commons-based, peer production think, collaborative development of open-source software like Linux or Wikipedia, immense value created outside traditional market mechanisms. We also see platform cooperatives, worker-owned alternatives to companies like Uber or DoorDash, aiming to distribute value and control more equitably among those actually creating it.
Interesting.
And leveraging decentralized technologies like blockchain is also explored for new forms of organization, value distribution, potentially creating a more participatory, equitable economy. The goal across these models is really to shift ownership, control, and value away from centralized capital towards networks of producers and communities.
Okay, so it sounds like, given how interconnected the polycrisis is, these individual solutions, even whole sectoral solutions like the circular economy, they aren't going to be enough on their own. We need deep, integrated collaboration across the board.
You've hit on the absolute core. The systemic, interconnected, amplifying nature of the polycrisis dictates the necessary form of its solution. A radical, non-negotiable commitment to transdisciplinary collaboration. Siloed solutions where experts stay in their own lanes, problems are tackled in isolation, they're not only likely to fail, they can also lead to unintended negative consequences. What the sources call maladaptation.
Maladaptation, like what?
Like, say, deploying renewable energy without carefully considering social equity. You might end up displacing local communities or deepening existing inequalities, even while trying to solve the climate problem.
Okay.
Or implementing purely technical solutions without understanding the social behaviors, the cultural norms that will shape whether people adopt them or not, might just render them ineffective. The complexity just demands integrated approaches.
So why do siloed solutions fail so spectacularly when faced with something like the polycrisis? It seems obvious, but what's the mechanism?
They fail because complex, wicked problems like climate change, like global health inequity, simply cannot be solved by any single discipline or sector or knowledge system working alone. It's impossible. Technical fixes, economic fixes, they're insufficient if they don't account for complex social behaviors, underlying political economies, fundamental issues of justice and equity, or invaluable local and indigenous knowledge. Think about a policy solution designed in a capital city, right? By experts. It might be entirely ineffective, even harmful, if it doesn't incorporate the specific context, the lived experience of the communities where it's supposed to be implemented.
Right. Needs buy-in and local fit.
Exactly. And this isn't just some idealistic preference for collaboration. The sources argue it's a functional necessity for navigating the profound complexity of the polycrisis.
So it's about genuinely co-defining problems from the start, co-producing knowledge, and co-creating solutions with diverse partners, not just consulting them at the end.
Precisely. Transdisciplinary research, or TDR, provides a structured, iterative process for this. It's where academic experts from different fields and non-academic actors, policymakers, community leaders, businesses, indigenous peoples work together as equal partners from the beginning. This involves jointly defining the problem from everyone's perspective, pooling diverse forms of knowledge, formal science, practical experience, indigenous wisdom, they're all valuable. And then collaboratively developing and implementing solutions that are both effective and socially just. Now, this isn't easy, let's be clear. Navigating inherent power dynamics, conflicting interests, deeply ingrained knowledge silos, these are critical barriers that have to be actively and intentionally addressed for this kind of collaboration to actually work effectively and equitably. It's a challenging shift, but absolutely essential.
Okay, this comprehensive collaborative approach.
Yeah.
It sounds incredibly daunting, especially given the scale of the challenges and those barriers you just mentioned. What then are the biggest obstacles standing in the way of this kind of systemic change and deep collaboration? What should we be most aware of?
Our sources identify 4 main categories of obstacles. And it's critical to understand them because they aren't minor hurdles. They're deeply ingrained systemic challenges requiring immense effort to overcome. First, we face biophysical realities and limits. Plain and simple. Humanity's agency is fundamentally constrained by the viability of Earth's ecosystems, the finite availability of resources and energy, and the planet's capacity to absorb our waste.
The laws of physics and biology.
Exactly. We've already, in many areas, depleted, polluted, or overused critical resources. Aquifers drawn down alarmingly, high-quality ores dwindling, vast forests logged. The sources pose a critical, uncomfortable question. Can we realistically cut humanity's massive planetary footprint while still growing the global economy indefinitely?
The answer seems to be no.
Current analysis strongly suggests no. Furthermore, how many humans can the planet sustainably support at an equitable material consumption level? Estimates vary, but often range from maybe 1 to 3 billion, which puts our current population of over 8 billion in stark perspective. It underscores the immense challenge of resource management and distribution. Then there are cognitive biases and behavioral traits, things inherent to human psychology. Our evolutionary wiring often makes addressing these long-term diffuse crises incredibly challenging.
How so?
We tend to discount the future, right? Favoring immediate rewards over future costs. It's a stark contrast to some indigenous societies that famously planned for 7 generations ahead. Tribalism, ingrained in group-out-group dynamics, they fuel polarization, making it hard to find common ground, hard to break from unsustainable norms, especially when things feel uncertain or threatening.
Us versus them.
Exactly, and we also struggle to comprehend the sheer scale and slow-moving nature of global problems. Global warming, biodiversity loss. They operate at scales that often defy our intuitive human grasp, leading to disconnect, denial, inaction. Next, we confront deeply entrenched socioeconomic systems and beliefs. Modern capitalist societies, with all their material abundance and tech wonders, are built on foundational beliefs. Beliefs in individual self-interest as the main driver, endless economic growth as the goal, and human exceptionalism, the idea that our ingenuity can always overcome any natural limit.
Right. Tech will save us.
That narrative. These beliefs, while relatively recent in the grand scheme of human history, are significant obstacles because they actively resist fundamental change. The sources explicitly state that our global economy, the developed world, largely arose from exploiting abundant fossil fuels, creating a system that simply cannot persist in its current form without catastrophic consequences. So we're dealing not just with economic structures, but deeply held cultural narratives, powerful vested interests that vehemently resist any shift away from that model. And finally, we face a diminished capacity for systemic action. As we discussed, siloed thinking problems in boxes prevents holistic solutions. When risks cut across administrative, social, scientific boundaries, they often exceed any single manager's expertise, so they get ignored or passed on.
Hot potato.
Pretty much. When multiple domains are affected, actors might free ride, hoping someone else will bear the cost of fixing it. And deep uncertainty itself fosters competing policy prescriptions, which aggravates the loss of trust in government's ability to solve problems, leading to public disengagement. All these pressures make coordinated, long-term, truly systemic action incredibly difficult to initiate and sustain.
Okay, so given these formidable obstacles, what are the crucial considerations that impact makers, leaders, whether they're in government, business, NGOs, communities? What do they need to grasp to effectively navigate this polycrisis?
A crucial, often overlooked understanding is that domestic politics frequently drive international instability. What happens inside countries often spills outwards. The fragmentation, the unilateralism we see globally, often direct reflections of internal national dynamics, political shifts, electoral pressures. So first, understanding the shifting geopolitical landscape and the rise of middle powers is key. With the U.S. showing, let's say, a tendency to recede from its traditional multilateral leadership role at times. Middle powers like India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Nigeria are increasingly stepping into the breach, acting as champions of global public goods, climate action, equitable development. This indicates a definite shift towards a more multipolar world. It requires different forms of international cooperation, less reliant on maybe one or two dominant powers. The sources note, for instance, how a U.S. administration focused inward effectively froze development aid, dissolved previous climate finance commitments, creating a vacuum these middle powers are starting to fill, though obviously with their own interests too.
Right. Second point.
Second, rethinking global finance and debt is absolutely critical. The initial hope, maybe under the Biden administration, of relying heavily on the private sector for climate finance, well, it largely failed to materialize at the scale needed. And with potential political shifts, commitments from big banks that were focused on climate initiatives have reportedly weakened or dissolved.
So we can't count on private finance alone.
This casting off the illusion, as one source put it, that private finance would inherently prioritize climate over profit. It opens a vital opportunity to refocus on fundamental financial reforms. These must include addressing the cripplingly high cost of capital for global South countries, which stops them financing adaptation and development, and the unsustainable debts owed, often to private creditors. Things like the Vatican's call for debt forgiveness, proposals from the UN's Financing for Development conferences. They highlight critical, if challenging, pathways to address these systemic inequities in the global financial architecture.
Okay, third.
Third, the role of critical resources and technology transfer is paramount for equitable development. Tech transfers are essential if developing countries are to move up the value chain, not just remain exporters of raw material.
Right, processing locally.
Exactly. Countries rich in critical minerals, Indonesia with nickel, Latin American nations with copper, lithium, increasingly want to emulate Indonesia's use of export bans to leverage their reserves, forcing technology transfer and local processing, keeping more value in home. However, a Columbia University study found such transfers remain scarce in reality. South Africa, during its G20 presidency, plans to push for harnessing these minerals for broader African development, not just raw export. And crucially, the WTO adopting proposals from the African group, seeking to make tech transfer a condition of foreign investments. That's seen as vital for truly equitable, sustainable development in the global South.
Makes sense. Fourth consideration.
Fourth, domestic politics and media control are central to shaping public opinion and ultimately policy responses. The battle over public opinion, especially around disinformation, polarization is increasingly waged on platforms controlled by tech giants.
Okay.
Brazil, interestingly, has demonstrated that states can effectively challenge these platforms, demanding adherence to anti-disinformation laws. The European Commission is actively investigating platforms like X under their Digital Services Act, holding them accountable. This highlights the immense importance of national policies, strong political coalitions, and shaping broader responses to misinformation, safeguarding democracy, and ultimately enabling collective action on the polycrisis. You can't act if the public square is poisoned.
Very true. And lastly,
The role of climate diplomacy in a fragmented world is more complex, more challenging than ever. Climate disasters continue affecting billions, disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable. With increasing international fragmentation, geopolitical tensions, climate diplomacy faces profound challenges. But there are signs of adaptation. COP events are now giving formal space to trade-related climate measures, acknowledging the economic links. Multilateral banks are extending catastrophe clauses in loans, providing some relief during climate shocks. There's growing recognition of the need for more concessional, grant-based finance, especially for vulnerable nations.
so some movement.
Some movement. And land-use conflicts are fundamental. Think about the return of COP to Brazil. The tensions between forestry, renewable energy development, food systems, they often clash dramatically. These complex interactions demand increasingly integrated, nuanced diplomatic efforts.
Okay, so after identifying these obstacles and critical considerations, how do we actually steer through this incredibly complex crisis toward better outcomes? What are the key strategies or conceptual tools the sources suggest we have for positive systemic change?
The sources propose three prominent and actually quite interconnected approaches to understanding and driving systems change. These are leverage points, tipping points, and three-dimensional stability landscapes, culminating in something called cross-impact balance analysis. Each gives a different but complementary lens. First, leverage points. Donella Meadows talked about these. They're defined as places to intervene in a system where a relatively small action can have a profound, disproportionate effect. If, and this is key, that action is precisely tailored to the system's inherent features.
Like finding the right spot on a lever.
Exactly. Think of strategic investments in green energy tech to rapidly drive down costs and accelerate adoption. Or central bank policies that intentionally divert investment away from brown fossil fuel assets towards green tech using financial incentives or disincentives. The power of leverage points is their potential efficiency. But a common limitation is they often focus on a single system or sector,
Right.
which can mean inadvertently overlooking critical interdependencies or potential trade-offs. For example, removing fossil fuel subsidies clearly good for the climate could cause temporary higher energy costs, political backlash, if not managed carefully with compensatory measures for those affected.
Okay, so leverage points are targeted. What about tipping points?
Tipping points build on that. These are interventions designed to generate widespread, transformative change in multiple interconnected systems, simultaneously energy, transport, food, political, legal, financial systems, all at once. There's this concept of super leverage points triggering one key tipping point, like, say, the widespread affordable use of green ammonia for fuel and fertilizer. That could cascade into green energy production, decarbonized steel, sustainable aviation fuel, a whole chain reaction. The influential Global Tipping Points report focuses specifically on the demand side, on social behaviors. Recognizing the immense power of collective action, shifts in norms, technological breakthroughs working together.
But it sounds tricky to manage.
It is. The challenge is accurately identifying these elusive points in highly complex systems,
Right.
and then understanding precisely how to guide the system to a desired new, more resilient state once a tipping point is breached, rather than letting it fall into an undesirable state. It's not just about triggering change, it's about steering it.
That sounds quite abstract, trying to visualize a 3D stability landscape, but it feels really important for envisioning genuinely new solutions beyond just fixing the current system.
It is abstract but incredibly powerful conceptually. Three-dimensional stability landscapes are metaphorical tools. They help us visualize all possible stable states of Earth's combined system of systems, ecological, social, economic. Rockstrom and colleagues, for example, propose envisioning a renew the future equilibrium. A positive landscape, a stable basin of attraction where humanity not only thrives within planetary boundaries, but actively rebuilds and regenerates nature.
A desirable future state.
Exactly. These landscapes also help us identify evolutionary traps. These are practices like our reliance on fossil fuels that were once adaptive, provided benefits, but became harmful, unsustainable, leading us towards undesirable equilibria, deep valleys we get stuck in. These traps aren't stable states themselves, but rather stable trajectories that ensnare us, making radical redirection incredibly challenging without a deep understanding of the systemic forces keeping us on that path.
Okay, so landscapes help visualize possibilities and traps. And cross-impact balance analysis takes this further.
And cross-impact balance, CIB analysis, takes this conceptual understanding a critical step further, making it more rigorous. CIB analysis is a mathematically based method for identifying possible stable futures in highly interdependent systems. It allows analysts to map that vast, multidimensional possibility space of global systems more precisely than just intuition can. By identifying key state variables could be economic growth, trust in institutions, biodiversity levels, and quantifying their complex interactions, CIB can reveal internally consistent scenarios. It can rigorously assess the consistency of potential futures. Crucially, can even incorporate qualitative things like different worldviews, cultural values, belief systems into the hard data analysis. By translating them into conditional interactions between variables, this can help identify potentially surprising but beneficial stable futures that might otherwise be overlooked. This tool gives us a much better sense of the complex topography, the ups and downs of the socio-ecological landscape. It helps identify positive pathways towards more resilient futures, helping us navigate profound uncertainty with more informed strategic decision-making. Hashtag outro.
Wow. What a journey through the concept of the polycrisis, the challenges, and importantly, its potential solutions. It's really clear that this isn't just a moment of profound peril, but also, as the sources so powerfully put it, a poly-opportunity.
Indeed. The analysis is undoubtedly sobering. Let's not downplay that. The future, if we continue on our current trajectory, looks bleak, and the sources reinforce again and again. Inaction is not a neutral choice. It's an active decision to accept escalating instability, deepening inequality, and widespread human suffering on an unprecedented scale.
But the profound systemic nature of these entangled crises, the very thing that makes them so dangerous, also presents an urgent and, in many ways, an inescapable invitation.
Precisely. It's a non-negotiable invitation to consciously, collaboratively design the successor to the systems that brought us here, to this precipice. Our ability to navigate the inevitable shocks while staying focused on steering towards a more sustainable, equitable, regenerative world, that's absolutely key. It's about recognizing that while we cannot avoid some degree of unraveling, the extent of it, and critically, what we choose to make of it, what we build next,
Right.
that is still very much in our collective hands.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider this provocative thought. How might you, in your own life, your own community, your own work, identify and strategically leverage a tipping point, however small it might seem, to contribute to the cascading transformations needed for a more resilient and just future for all?